Chapter 10. The Return of the Lion. To keep along the edge of the gorge was not so easy as it had looked. Before they had gone many yards, they were confronted with young fir woods growing on the very edge, and after they had tried to go through these, stooping and pushing for about 10 minutes, they realized that, in there, it would take them an hour to do half a mile. So they came back and out again and decided to go round the fir wood. This took them much farther to their right than they wanted to go, far out of sight of the cliffs and out of sound of the river, till they began to be afraid they had lost it altogether. Nobody knew the time, but it was getting to the hottest part of the day. When they were able to get to at last to go back to the edge of the gorge, nearly a mile below the point from which they had started, they found the cliffs on their side of it a good deal lower and more broken. Soon they found a way down into the gorge and continued the journey at the river's edge. But first they had a rest and a long drink. No one was talking any more about breakfast or even dinner with Caspian. They may have been wise to stick to the rush instead of going along the top. It kept them sure of their direction, and ever since the fir wood they had all been afraid of being forced too far out of their course and losing themselves in the wood. It was an old and pathless forest, and you could not keep anything like a straight course in it. Patches of hopeless brambles, fallen trees, boggy places and dense undergrowth would always be getting in your way. But the gorge of the Rush was not at all a nice place for traveling either. I mean, it was not a nice place for people in a hurry. For an afternoon's ramble ending in a picnic tea, it would have been delightful. It had everything you could want on an occasion of that sort. Rumbling waterfalls, silver cascades, deep amber-colored pools, mossy rocks, and deep moss on the banks in which you could sink in over your ankles, every kind of fern, jewel-like dragonflies, sometimes a hawk overhead, and once, Peter and Trumpkin both thought, an eagle. But of course what the children and the dwarf wanted to see as soon as possible was the great river below them and Baruna and the way to Aslan's How. As they went on, the rush began to fall more and more steeply. Their journey became more and more of a climb and less of a walk, in places even a dangerous climb over slippery rock with a nasty drop into dark chasms, and the river roaring angrily at the bottom. You may be sure they watched the cliffs on their left eagerly for any sign of a break or any place where they could climb them. But those cliffs remained cruel. It was maddening because everyone knew that if once they were out of the gorge on that side, they would have only a smooth slope and a fairly short walk to Caspian's headquarters. The boys and the dwarf were now in favor of lighting a fire and cooking their bear meat. Susan didn't want this. She only wanted, as she said, to get on and finish it and get out of these beastly woods. Lucy was far too tired and miserable to have any opinion about anything. But as there was no dry wood to be had, it mattered very little what anyone thought. The boys began to wonder if raw meat was really as nasty as they had always been told. Trumpkin assured them it was. Of course, if the children had attempted a journey like this a few days ago in England, they would have been worn out. I think I have explained before how Narnia was altering them. Even Lucy was by now, so to speak, only 1/3 of a little girl going to boarding school for the first time, and 2/3 of Queen Lucy of Narnia. "And alas," said Susan. "Oh, hooray," said Peter. The river gorge had just made a bend, and the whole view spread out beneath them. They could see open country stretching before them to the horizon, and, between it and them, the broad silver ribbon of the great river. They could see the specially broad and shallow place, which had once been the fords of Baruna, but was now spanned by a long, many-arched bridge. There was a little town at the far end of it. "By Jove," said Edmund, "we fought the Battle of Baruna, just where that town is." This cheered the boys more than anything. You can't help feeling stronger when you look at a place where you won a glorious victory, not to mention a kingdom, hundreds of years ago. Peter and Edmund were soon so busy talking about the battle that they forgot their sore feet and the heavy drag of their mail shirts on their shoulders. The dwarf was interested too. They were all getting on at a quicker pace now. The going became easier. Though there were still sheer cliffs on their left, the ground was becoming lower on their right. Soon it was no longer a gorge at all, only a valley. There were no more waterfalls, and presently they were in fairly thick woods again. Then, all at once, whiz, and a sound rather like the stroke of a woodpecker. The children were still wondering where, ages ago, they had heard a sound just like that and why they disliked it so, when Trumpkin shouted, "Down!" at the same moment forcing Lucy, who happened to be next to him, flat down into the bracken. Peter, who had been looking up to see if he could spot a squirrel, had seen what it was. A long, cruel arrow had sunk into a tree trunk just above his head. As he pulled Susan down and dropped himself, another came rasping over his shoulder and struck the ground at his side. "Quick, quick! Get back! Crawl!" panted Trumpkin. They turned and wriggled along uphill under the bracken amid clouds of horribly buzzing flies. Arrows whizzed round them. One struck Susan's helmet with a sharp ping and glanced off. They crawled quicker. Sweat poured off them. Then they ran, stooping nearly double. The boys held their swords in their hands for fear they would trip them up. It was heartbreaking work, all uphill again, back over the ground they had already traveled. When they felt that they really couldn't run any more, even to save their lives, they all dropped down in the damp moss beside a waterfall and behind a big boulder, panting. They were surprised to see how high they had already got. They listened intently and heard no sound of pursuit. "So that's all right," said Trumpkin, drawing a deep breath. "They're not searching the wood. Only sentries, I expect. But it means that Miraz has an outpost down there. Bottles and battledores, though. It was a near thing." "I ought to have my head smacked for bringing us this way at all," said Peter. "On the contrary, your Majesty," said the dwarf. "For one thing, it wasn't you, it was your royal brother, King Edmund, who first suggested going by Glasswater." "I'm afraid the DLF's right," said Edmund, who had quite honestly forgotten this ever since things began going wrong. "And for another," continued Trumpkin, "if we'd gone my way, we'd have walked straight into that new outpost most likely, or at least had just the same trouble avoiding it. I think this Glasswater route has turned out for the best." "A blessing in disguise," said Susan. "Some disguise," said Edmund. "I suppose we'll have to go right up the gorge again now," said Lucy. "Lou, you're a hero," said Peter. "That's the nearest you've got today to saying I told you so. Let's get on." "And as soon as we're well up into the forest," said Trumpkin, "whatever anyone says, I'm going to light a fire and cook supper, but we must get well away from here." There is no need to describe how they toiled back up the gorge. It was pretty hard work, but oddly enough everyone felt more cheerful. They were getting their second wind, and the word supper had had a wonderful effect. They reached the fir wood, which had caused them so much trouble while it was still daylight, and bivouacked in a hollow just above it. It was tedious gathering the firewood, but it was grand when the fire blazed up and they began producing the damp and smeary parcels of bear meat, which would have been so very unattractive to anyone who had spent the day indoors. The dwarf had splendid ideas about cookery. Each apple, they still had a few of these, was wrapped up in bear's meat, as if it was to be apple dumpling with meat instead of pastry, only much thicker, and spiked on a sharp stick and then roasted, and the juice of the apple worked all through the meat like apple sauce with roast pork. Bear that has lived too much on other animals is not very nice, but bear that has had plenty of honey and fruit is excellent, and this turned out to be that sort of bear. It was a truly glorious meal, and of course no washing up, only lying back and watching the smoke from Trumpkin's pipe and stretching one's tired legs and chatting. Everyone felt quite hopeful now about finding King Caspian tomorrow and defeating Miraz in a few days. It may not have been sensible of them to feel like this, but they did. They dropped off to sleep one by one, but all pretty quickly. Lucy woke out of the deepest sleep you can imagine with the feeling that the voice she liked best in the world had been calling her name. She thought at first it was her father's voice, but that did not seem quite right. Then she thought it was Peter's voice, but that did not seem to fit either. She did not want to get up, not because she was still tired. On the contrary, she was wonderfully rested and all the aches had gone from her bones, but because she felt so extremely happy and comfortable. She was looking straight up at the Narnian moon, which is larger than ours, and at the starry sky, for the place where they had bivouacked was comparatively open. "Lucy!" came the call again, neither her father's voice nor Peter's. She sat up, trembling with excitement, but not with fear. The moon was so bright that the whole forest landscape around her was almost as clear as day, though it looked wilder. Behind her was the fir wood, away to her right the jagged cliff tops on the far side of the gorge. Straight ahead, open grass to where a glade of trees began about a bowshot away. Lucy looked very hard at the trees of that glade. "Why, I do believe they're moving," she said to herself. "They're walking about." She got up, her heart beating wildly, and walked toward them. There was certainly a noise in the glade, a noise such as trees make in a high wind, though there was no wind tonight. Yet it was not exactly an ordinary tree noise either. Lucy felt there was a tune in it, but she could not catch the tune any more than she'd been able to catch the words when the trees had so nearly talked to her the night before. But there it was, at least, a lilt. She felt her own feet wanting to dance as she got nearer, and now there was no doubt that the trees were really moving in and out through one another, as if in a complicated country dance. And I suppose, thought Lucy, when trees dance, it must be a very, very country dance indeed. She was almost moving among them now. The first tree she looked at seemed at first glance to be not a tree at all, but a huge man with a shaggy beard and great bushes of hair. She was not frightened. She had seen such things before. But when she looked again, he was only a tree, though he was still moving. You couldn't see whether he had feet or roots, of course, because when trees move, they don't walk on the surface of the earth. They wade in it as we do in water. The same thing happened with every tree she looked at. At one moment they seemed to be the friendly, lovely giant and giantess forms which the tree people put on when some good magic has called them into full life. Next moment they all looked like trees again. But when they looked like trees, it was like strangely human trees, and when they looked like people, it was like strangely branchy and leafy people, and all the time that queer lilting, rustling, cool, merry noise. "They're almost awake. Not quite," said Lucy. She knew she herself was wide awake, wider than anyone usually is. She went fearlessly in among them, dancing herself as she leaped this way and that to avoid being run into by these huge partners. But she was only half interested in them. She wanted to get beyond them to something else. It was from beyond them that the dear voice had called. She soon got through them, half wondering whether she'd been using her arms to push branches aside or to take hands in a great chain with big dancers who stooped to reach her, for they were really a ring of trees around a central open place. She stepped out from among their shifting confusion of lovely lights and shadows. A circle of grass, smooth as a lawn, met her eyes, with dark trees dancing all around it. And then, oh joy, for he was there, the huge lion, shining white in the moonlight, with his huge black shadow underneath him. But for the movement of his tail he might have been a stone lion, but Lucy never thought of that. She never stopped to think whether he was a friendly lion or not. She rushed to him. She felt her heart would burst if she lost a moment, and the next thing she knew was that she was kissing him and putting her arms as far around his neck as she could and burying her face in the beautiful rich silkiness of his mane. "Aslan, Aslan, dear Aslan," sobbed Lucy, "at last!" The great beast rolled over on his side so that Lucy fell, half sitting and half lying between his front paws. He bent forward and just touched her nose with his tongue. His warm breath came all round her. She gazed up into the large, wise face. "Welcome, child," he said. "Aslan," said Lucy, "you're bigger." "That is because you're older, little one," answered he. "Not because you are? I am not. But every year you grow, you will find me bigger." For a time she was so happy that she did not want to speak. But Aslan spoke. "Lucy," he said, "we must not lie here for long. You have work in hand, and much time has been lost today." "Yes, wasn't it a shame?" said Lucy. "I saw you all right. They wouldn't believe me. They're all so—" From somewhere deep inside Aslan's body there came the faintest suggestion of a growl. "I'm sorry," said Lucy, who understood some of his moods. I didn't mean to start slanging the others. But it wasn't my fault anyway, was it?" The lion looked straight into her eyes. "Oh, Aslan," said Lucy, "you don't mean it was? How could I? I couldn't have left the others and come up to you alone. How could I? Don't look at me like that." "Oh, well, I suppose I could. Yes, and it wouldn't have been alone, I know, not if I was with you. But what would have been the good?" Aslan said nothing. "You mean," said Lucy rather faintly, "that it would have turned out all right, somehow? But how? Please, Aslan, am I not to know?" "To know what would have happened, child?" said Aslan. "No, nobody is ever told that." "Oh dear," said Lucy. "But anyone can find out what will happen," said Aslan. "If you go back to the others now and wake them up and tell them you have seen me again and that you must all get up at once and follow me, what will happen? There is only one way of finding out." "Do you mean that's what you want me to do?" gasped Lucy. "Yes, little one," said Aslan. "Will the others see you too?" asked Lucy. "Certainly not at first," said Aslan. "Later on, it depends." "But they won't believe me," said Lucy. "It doesn't matter," said Aslan. Oh, dear," said Lucy. "And I was so pleased at finding you again, and I thought you'd let me stay, and I thought you'd come roaring in and frighten all the enemies away, like last time, and now everything's going to be horrid." "It is hard for you, little one," said Aslan, "but things never happen the same way twice. It has been hard for us all in Narnia before now." Lucy buried her head in his mane to hide from his face, but there must have been magic in his mane. She could feel lion strength going into her. Quite suddenly she sat up. "I'm sorry, Aslan," she said. "I'm ready now." "Now you are a lioness," said Aslan, "and now all Narnia will be renewed. But come, we have no time to lose." He got up and walked with stately, noiseless paces back to the belt of dancing trees through which she had just come, and Lucy went with him, laying a rather tremulous hand on his mane. The trees parted to let them through, and for 1 second assumed their human forms completely. Lucy had a glimpse of tall and lovely wood gods and wood goddesses all bowing to the lion. Next moment they were trees again, but still bowing, with such graceful sweeps of branch and trunk that their bowing was itself a kind of dance. "Now, child," said Aslan, when they had left the trees behind them, "I will wait here. Go and wake the others and tell them to follow. If they will not, then you, at least, must follow me alone. It is a terrible thing to have to wake 4 people, all older than yourself, and all very tired, for the purpose of telling them something they probably won't believe and making them do something they certainly won't like. I mustn't think about it. I must just do it, thought Lucy. She went to Peter first and shook him. Peter, she whispered in his ear, wake up quick. Aslan is here. He says we've got to follow him at once. Certainly, Lou, whatever you like, said Peter unexpectedly. This was encouraging, but as Peter instantly rolled round and went to sleep again, it wasn't much use. Then she tried Susan. Susan did really wake up, but only to say in her most annoying grown-up voice, You've been dreaming, Lucy, go to sleep again. She tackled Edmund next. It was very difficult to wake him, but when at last she had done it, he was really awake and sat up. He said in a grumpy voice, what are you talking about? She said it all over again. This was one of the worst parts of her job, for each time she said it, it sounded less convincing. Aslan, said Edmund, jumping up. Hooray! Where? Lucy turned back to where she could see the lion waiting, his patient eyes fixed upon her. There, she said, pointing. Where? Asked Edmund again. There, don't you see? Just this side of the trees. Edmund stared hard for a while and then said, No, there's nothing there. You've got dazzled and muddled with the moonlight. One does, you know. I thought I saw something for a moment myself. It's only an optical, what do you call it? I can see him all the time, said Lucy. He's looking straight at us. Then why can't I see him? He said you mightn't be able to. Why? I don't know. That's what he said. Oh, bother it all, said Edmund. I do wish you wouldn't keep on seeing things, but I suppose we'll have to wake the others. Chapter 11. The Lion Roars. When the whole party was finally awake, Lucy had to tell her story for the 4th time. The blank silence which followed it was as discouraging as anything could be. I can't see anything, said Peter after he had stared, his eyes sore. Can you, Susan? No, of course I can't, snapped Susan, because there isn't anything to see. She's been dreaming. Do lie down and go to sleep, Lucy. And I do hope, said Lucy in a tremulous voice, that you will all come with me, because I'll have to go with him whether anyone else does or not. Don't talk nonsense, Lucy, said Susan. Of course you can't go off on your own. Don't let her, Peter. She's being downright naughty. I'll go with her if she must go, said Edmund. She's been right before. I know she has, said Peter, and she may have been right this morning. We certainly had no luck going down the gorge. Still, at this hour of the night? And why should Aslan be invisible to us? He never used to be. It's not like him. What does the DLF say? Oh, I say nothing at all, answered the dwarf. If you all go, of course, I'll go with you, and if your party splits up, I'll go with the High King. That's my duty to him and King Caspian. But if you ask my private opinion, I'm a plain dwarf who doesn't think there's much chance of finding a road by night where you couldn't find one by day. And I have no use for magic lions, which are talking lions and don't talk, and friendly lions, though they don't do us any good, and whopping big lions, though nobody can see them. It's all bilge and beanstalks as far as I can see. He's beating his paw on the ground for us to hurry, said Lucy. We must go now. At least I must. You've no right to try to force the rest of us like that. It's 4-1 and you're the youngest, said Susan. Oh, come on, growled Edmund. We've got to go. There'll be no peace till we do. He fully intended to back Lucy up, but he was annoyed at losing his night's sleep and was making up for it by doing everything as sulkily as possible. On the march, then, said Peter, wearily fitting his arm into his shield strap and putting his helmet on. At any other time he would have said something nice to Lucy, who was his favorite sister, for he knew how wretched she must be feeling, and he knew that, whatever had happened, it was not her fault. But he couldn't help being a little annoyed with her all the same. Susan was the worst. Supposing I started behaving like Lucy, she said, I might threaten to stay here, whether the rest of you went on or not. I jolly well think I shall. Obey the High King, your Majesty, said Trumpkin, and let's be off. If I'm not to be allowed to sleep, I'd as soon march as stand here talking. And so at last they got on the move. Lucy went first, biting her lip and trying not to say all the things she thought of saying to Susan. But she forgot them when she fixed her eyes on Aslan. He turned and walked at a slow pace about 30 yards ahead of them. The others had only Lucy's directions to guide them, for Aslan was not only invisible to them, but silent as well. His big cat-like paws made no noise on the grass. He led them to the right of the dancing trees. Whether they were still dancing nobody knew, for Lucy had her eyes on the lion and the rest had their eyes on Lucy, and nearer the edge of the gorge. Cobbles and kettle drums, thought Trumpkin. I hope this madness isn't going to end up in a moonlight climb and broken necks. For a long way Aslan went along the top of the precipices. Then they came to a place where some little trees grew right on the edge. He turned and disappeared among them. Lucy held her breath, for it looked as if he had plunged over the cliff, but she was too busy keeping him in sight to stop and think about this. She quickened her pace and was soon among the trees herself. Looking down, she could see a steep and narrow path going slantwise down into the gorge between rocks, and Aslan descending it. He turned and looked at her with his happy eyes. Lucy clapped her hands and began to scramble down after him. From behind her, she heard the voices of the others shouting, "Hi, Lucy, look out, for goodness sake! You're right on the edge of the gorge! Come back!" And then, a moment later, Edmund's voice saying, "No, she's right, there is a way down." Halfway down the path, Edmund caught up with her. "Look," he said in great excitement. "Look, what's that shadow crawling down in front of us?" "It's his shadow," said Lucy. I do believe you're right, Lou," said Edmund. "I can't think how I didn't see it before, but where is he?" "With his shadow, of course. Can't you see him?" "Well, I almost thought I did, for a moment. It's such a rum light." "Get on, King Edmund, get on," came Trumpkin's voice from behind and above. And then, farther behind and still nearly at the top, Peter's voice saying, "Oh, buck up, Susan, give me your hand. Why, a baby could get down here, and do stop grousing." In a few minutes they were at the bottom, and the roaring of water filled their ears. Treading delicately like a cat, Aslan stepped from stone to stone across the stream. In the middle he stopped, bent down to drink, and as he raised his shaggy head, dripping from the water, he turned to face them again. This time Edmund saw him. "Oh, Aslan!" he cried, darting forward, but the lion whisked round and began padding up the slope on the far side of the rush. "Peter, Peter!" cried Edmund. "Did you see?" "I saw something," said Peter, "but it's so tricky in this moonlight. On we go, though, and 3 cheers for Lucy. I don't feel half so tired now, either." Aslan, without hesitation, led them to their left, farther up the gorge. The whole journey was odd and dreamlike, the roaring stream, the wet grey grass, the glimmering cliffs which they were approaching, and always the glorious, silently pacing beast ahead. Everyone except Susan and the dwarf could see him now. Presently they came to another steep path up the face of the farther precipices. These were far higher than the ones they had just ascended, and the journey up them was a long and tedious zigzag. Fortunately, the moon shone right above the gorge, so that neither side was in shadow. Lucy was nearly blown when the tail and hind legs of Aslan disappeared over the top, but with one last effort she scrambled after him and came out, rather shaky-legged and breathless, on the hill they had been trying to reach ever since they left Glasswater. The long, gentle slope, heather and grass, and a few very big rocks that shone white in the moonlight, stretched up to where it vanished in a glimmer of trees about half a mile away. She knew it. It was the hill of the stone table. With a jingling of mail, the others climbed up behind her. Aslan glided on before them, and they walked after him. "Lucy," said Susan in a very small voice. "Yes," said Lucy. I see him now. I'm sorry." "That's all right. But I've been far worse than you know. I really believed it was him, yesterday, when he warned us not to go down to the fir wood, and I really believed it was him tonight when you woke us up, deep down inside, or I could have if I'd let myself. But I just wanted to get out of the woods, and I don't know, and whatever am I to say to him?" "Perhaps you won't need to say much," suggested Lucy. Soon they reached the trees, and through them the children could see the great mound, Aslan's howe, which had been raised over the table since their days. "Our side don't keep very good watch," muttered Trumpkin. "We ought to have been challenged before now." "Hush," said the other 4, for now Aslan had stopped and turned and stood facing them, looking so majestic that they felt as glad as anyone can who feels afraid, and as afraid as anyone can who feels glad. The boys strode forward. Lucy made way for them. Susan and the dwarf shrank back. "Oh, Aslan," said King Peter, dropping on one knee and raising the lion's heavy paw to his face, "I'm so glad, and I'm so sorry. I've been leading them wrong ever since we started, and especially yesterday morning." "My dear son," said Aslan. Then he turned and welcomed Edmund. "Well done," were his words. Then, after an awful pause, the deep voice said, "Susan." Susan made no answer, but the others thought she was crying. "You have listened to fears, child," said Aslan. "Come, let me breathe on you. Forget them. Are you brave again?" "A little," Aslan, said Susan. "And now," said Aslan in a much louder voice, with just a hint of roar in it, while his tail lashed his flanks, "and now where is this little dwarf, this famous swordsman and archer who doesn't believe in lions? Come here, son of earth, come here!" And the last word was no longer the hint of a roar, but almost the real thing. "Wraiths and wreckage!" gasped Trumpkin in the ghost of a voice. The children, who knew Aslan well enough to see that he liked the dwarf very much, were not disturbed, But it was quite another thing for Trumpkin, who had never seen a lion before, let alone this lion. He did the only sensible thing he could have done, that is, instead of bolting, he tottered toward Aslan. Aslan pounced. Have you ever seen a very young kitten being carried in the mother cat's mouth? It was like that. The dwarf, hunched up in a little miserable ball, hung from Aslan's mouth. The lion gave him one shake, and all his armor rattled like a tinker's pack. And then, hey presto, the dwarf flew up in the air. He was as safe as if he had been in bed, though he did not feel so. As he came down, the huge velvety paws caught him as gently as a mother's arms and set him right way up, too, on the ground. "Son of Earth, shall we be friends?" asked Aslan. Yes, panted the dwarf, for it had not yet got its breath back. "Now," said Aslan, "the moon is setting. Look behind you. There is the dawn beginning. We have no time to lose. You three, you sons of Adam and son of Earth, hasten into the mound and deal with what you will find there." The dwarf was still speechless, and neither of the boys dared to ask if Aslan would follow them. All three drew their swords and saluted, then turned and jingled away into the dusk. Lucy noticed that there was no sign of weariness in their faces. Both the High King and King Edmund looked more like men than boys. The girls watched them out of sight, standing close beside Aslan. The light was changing. Low down in the east, Aravir, the morning star of Narnia, gleamed like a little moon. Aslan, who seemed larger than before, lifted his head, shook his mane, and roared. The sound, deep and throbbing at first like an organ beginning on a low note, rose and became louder, and then far louder again, till the earth and air were shaking with it. It rose up from that hill and floated across all Narnia. Down in Miraz's camp, men woke, stared palely in one another's faces, and grasped their weapons. Down below that, in the great river, now at its coldest hour, the heads and shoulders of the nymphs and the great weedy-bearded head of the river god rose from the water. Beyond it, in every field and wood, the alert ears of rabbits rose from their holes, the sleepy heads of birds came out from under wings, owls hooted, vixens barked, hedgehogs grunted, the trees stirred. In towns and villages, mothers pressed babies close to their breasts, staring with wild eyes, dogs whimpered, and men leaped up, groping for lights. Far away on the northern frontier, the mountain giants peered from the dark gateways of their castles. What Lucy and Susan saw was a dark something coming to them from almost every direction across the hills. It looked first like a black mist creeping on the ground, then like the stormy waves of a black sea rising higher and higher as it came on, and then at last, like what it was, woods on the move. All the trees of the world appeared to be rushing toward Aslan. But as they drew nearer, they looked less like trees, and when the whole crowd, bowing and curtsying and waving thin, long arms to Aslan, were all around Lucy, she saw that it was a crowd of human shapes. Pale birch girls were tossing their heads. Willow women pushed back their hair from their brooding faces to gaze on Aslan. The queenly beeches stood still and adored him. Shaggy oak men, lean and melancholy elms, shock-headed hollies, dark themselves, but their wives all bright with berries, and gay rowans all bowed and rose again, shouting, "Aslan, Aslan," in their various husky or creaking or wave-like voices. The crowd and the dance round Aslan, for it had become a dance once more, grew so thick and rapid that Lucy was confused. She never saw where certain other people came from, who were soon capering about among the trees. One was a youth, dressed only in a fawn skin, with vine leaves wreathed in his curly hair. His face would have been almost too pretty for a boy's if it had not looked so extremely wild. You felt, as Edmund said when he saw him a few days later, "There's a chap who might do anything, absolutely anything." He seemed to have a great many names. Bromios, Basileus, and the Ram were three of them. There were a lot of girls with him, as wild as he. There was even, unexpectedly, someone on a donkey, and everyone was laughing, and everyone was shouting, "Oo-on, oo-on, oo-oi, oi, oi." "Is it a romp, Aslan?" cried the youth, and apparently it was. But nearly everyone seemed to have a different idea as to what they were playing. It may have been Tig, but Lucy never discovered who was it. It was rather like Blind Man's Bluff, only everyone behaved as if they were blindfolded. It was not unlike Hunt the Slipper, but the slipper was never found. What made it more complicated was that the man on the donkey, who was old and enormously fat, began calling out at once, "Refreshments! Time for refreshments!" and falling off his donkey and being bundled onto it again by the others, while the donkey was under the impression that the whole thing was a circus and tried to give a display of walking on its hind legs. And all the time there were more and more vine leaves everywhere. Soon, not only leaves, but vines. They were climbing up everything. They were running up the legs of the tree people and circling around their necks. Lucy put up her hands to push back her hair and found she was pushing back vine branches. The donkey was a mass of them. His tail was completely entangled, and something dark was nodding between his ears. Lucy looked again and saw it was a bunch of grapes. After that it was mostly grapes, overhead and underfoot and all around. "Refreshments! Refreshments!" roared the old man. Everyone began eating, and whatever hothouses your people may have, you have never tasted such grapes. Really good grapes, firm and tight on the outside, but bursting into cool sweetness when you put them into your mouth, were one of the things the girls had never had quite enough of before. Here there were more than anyone could possibly want, and no table manners at all. One saw sticky and stained fingers everywhere, and though mouths were full, the laughter never ceased, nor the yodeling cries of "You-on, you-on, yo-yo-yo-yo," till all of a sudden everyone felt at the same moment that the game, whatever it was, and the feast ought to be over, and everyone flopped down breathless on the ground and turned their faces to Aslan to hear what he would say next. At that moment the sun was just rising, and Lucy remembered something and whispered to Susan, "I say, Sue, I know who they are." "Who?" "The boy with the wild face is Bacchus, and the old one on the donkey is Silenus. Don't you remember Mr. Tumnus telling us about them long ago?" "Yes, of course. But I say, Lou." "What?" "I wouldn't have felt safe with Bacchus and all his wild girls if we'd met them without Aslan." "I should think not," said Lucy. Chapter 12. Sorcery and Sudden Vengeance. Meanwhile, Trumpkin and the two boys arrived at the dark little stone archway which led into the inside of the mound, and two sentinel badgers, the white patches on their cheeks were all Edmund could see of them, leaped up with bared teeth and asked them in snarling voices, "Who goes there?" "Trumpkin," said the dwarf, "bringing the High King of Narnia out of the far past." The badgers nosed at the boys' hands. "At last," they said, "at last." "Give us a light, friends," said Trumpkin. The badgers found a torch just inside the arch, and Peter lit it and handed it to Trumpkin. "The DLF had better lead," he said. "We don't know our way about this place." Trumpkin took the torch and went ahead into the dark tunnel. It was a cold, black, musty place with an occasional bat fluttering in the torchlight, and plenty of cobwebs. The boys, who had been mostly in the open air ever since that morning at the railway station, felt as if they were going into a trap or prison. "I say, Peter," whispered Edmund, "look at those carvings on the walls. Don't they look old? And yet we're older than that. When we were last here they hadn't been made." "Yes," said Peter, "that makes one think." The dwarf went on ahead, and then turned to the right, and then to the left, and then down some steps, and then to the left again. Then at last they saw a light ahead, light from under a door. And now for the first time they heard voices, for they had come to the door of the central chamber. The voices inside were angry ones. Someone was talking so loudly that the approach of the boys and the dwarf had not been heard. "Don't like the sound of that," whispered Trumpkin to Peter. "Let's listen for a moment." All three stood perfectly still on the outside of the door. "You know well enough," said a voice. "That's the king," whispered Trumpkin, "why the horn was not blown at sunrise this morning. Have you forgotten that Miraz fell upon us almost before Trumpkin had gone? And we were fighting for our lives for the space of 3 hours and more? I blew it when first I had a breathing space." "I'm not likely to forget it," came the angry voice, "when my dwarves bore the brunt of the attack, and 1 in 5 of them fell." "That's Knickerbrick," whispered Trumpkin. "For shame, dwarf," came a thick voice. "Truffle hunters," said Trumpkin. "We all did as much as the dwarves, and none more than the king." "Tell that tale your own way for all I care," answered Knickerbrick. "But whether it was that the horn was blown too late, or whether there was no magic in it, no help has come. You great clerk, you master magician, you know all. Are you still asking us to hang our hopes on Aslan and King Peter and all the rest of it?" "I must confess, I cannot deny it, that I am deeply disappointed in the results of the operation," came the answer. "That'll be Dr. Cornelius," said Trumpkin. To speak plainly," said Knickerbrick, "your wallet's empty, your eggs addled, your fish uncaught, your promises broken. Stand aside, then, and let others work. And that is why—" "The help will come," said Truffle Hunter. "I stand by Aslan. Have patience, like us beasts. The help will come. It may be even now at the door." "Pah!" snarled Knickerbrick. "You badgers would have us wait till the sky falls, and we can all catch larks. I tell you, we can't wait. Food is running short. We lose more than we can afford at every encounter. Our followers are slipping away." "And why?" asked Truffle-hunter. "I'll tell you why. Because it is noised among them that we have called on the kings of old, and the kings of old have not answered. The last words Trumpkin spoke before he went, and went most likely to his death, were, 'If you must blow the horn, do not let the army know why you blow it or what you hope from it.' But that same evening everyone seemed to know." "You'd better have shoved your gray snout in a hornet's nest, Badger, than suggest that I'm the blab," said Knick-a-Brick. "Take it back, or—" "Oh, stop it, both of you," said King Caspian. "I want to know what it is that Knick-a-Brick keeps on hinting we should do. But before that, I want to know who those two strangers are whom he has brought into our council and who stand there with their ears open and their mouths shut." "They are friends of mine," said Knick-a-Brick. "And what better right have you yourself to be here than that you are a friend of Trumpkin's and the Badger's? And what right has that old dotard in the black gown to be here except that he is your friend? Why am I to be the only one who can't bring in his friends?" "His Majesty is the king to whom you have sworn allegiance," said Truffle-hunter sternly. Court manners," sneered Knick-a-Brick. "But in this hole we may talk plainly. You know, and he knows, that this Telmarine boy will be king of nowhere and nobody in a week, unless we can help him out of the trap in which he sits." "Perhaps," said Cornelius, "your new friends would like to speak for themselves. You there, who and what are you?" "Worshipful Master Doctor," came a thin, whining voice, "so please you, I'm only a poor old woman, I am, and very obliged to his worshipful dwarfship for his friendship, I'm sure. His Majesty, bless his handsome face, has no need to be afraid of an old woman that's nearly doubled up with the rheumatics and hasn't 2 sticks to put under her kettle. I have some poor little skill, not like yours, Master Doctor, of course, in small spells and cantrips that I'd be glad to use against our enemies if it was agreeable to all concerned, for I hate 'em. Oh, yes, no one hates better than me." "That is all most interesting and, satisfactory," said Dr. Cornelius. "I think I know now what you are, madam. Perhaps your other friend Knick-a-Brick would give some account of himself?" A dull gray voice at which Peter's flesh crept replied, "I'm hunger, I'm thirst. Where I bite, I hold till I die, and even after death they must cut out my mouthful from my enemy's body and bury it with me. I can fast 100 years and not die. I can lie 100 nights on the ice and not freeze. I can drink a river of blood and not burst. Show me your enemies." "And it is in the presence of these two that you wish to disclose your plan?" said Caspian. "Yes," said Knick-a-Brick, "and by their help that I mean to execute it." There was a minute or two during which Trumpkin and the boys could hear Caspian and his two friends speaking in low voices, but could not make out what they were saying. Then Caspian spoke aloud. "Well, Knick-a-Brick," he said, "we will hear your plan." There was a pause so long that the boys began to wonder if Knick-a-Brick were ever going to begin. When he did, it was in a lower voice, as if he himself did not much like what he was saying. "All said and done," he muttered, "none of us knows the truth about the ancient days in Narnia. Trumpkin believed none of the stories. I was ready to put them to the trial. We tried first the horn, and it has failed. If there ever was a High King Peter and a Queen Susan and a King Edmund and a Queen Lucy, then either they have not heard us, or they cannot come, or they are our enemies." "Or they are on the way," put in Truffle-hunter. "You can go on saying that till Miraz has fed us all to his dogs. As I was saying, we have tried one link in the chain of old legends, and it has done us no good. Well, but when your sword breaks, you draw your dagger. The stories tell of other powers besides the ancient kings and queens. How if we could call them up?" "If you mean Aslan," said Truffle-hunter, "it's all one calling on him and on the kings. They were his servants. If he will not send them, but I make no doubt he will, is he more likely to come himself?" "No, you're right there," said Knick-a-Brick. "Aslan and the kings go together. Either Aslan is dead, or he is not on our side, or else something stronger than himself keeps him back. And if he did come, how do we know he'd be our friend? He was not always a good friend to dwarfs, by all that's told. Not even to all beasts. Ask the wolves. And anyway, he was in Narnia only once that I ever heard of, and he didn't stay long. You may drop Aslan out of the reckoning. I was thinking of someone else." There was no answer, and for a few minutes it was so still that Edmund could hear the wheezy and snuffling breath of the badger. "Who do you mean?" said Caspian at last. "I mean a power so much greater than Aslan's that it held Narnia spellbound for years and years, if the stories are true. "The White Witch!" cried 3 voices all at once, and from the noise Peter guessed that 3 people had leapt to their feet. "Yes," said Knickerbrick very slowly and distinctly, "I mean the witch. Sit down again. Don't all take fright at a name as if you were children. We want power, and we want a power that will be on our side. As for power, do not the stories say that the witch defeated Aslan and bound him and killed him on that very stone which is over there just beyond the light?" "But they also say that he came to life again," said the Badger sharply. "Yes, they say," answered Knickerbrick, "but you'll notice that we hear precious little about anything he did afterward. He just fades out of the story. Had he explained that if he really came to life? Isn't it much more likely that he didn't, and that the stories say nothing more about him because there was nothing more to say?" "He established the kings and queens," said Caspian. "A king who has just won a great battle can usually establish himself without the help of a performing lion," said Knickerbrick. There was a fierce growl, probably from Trufflehunter. "And anyway," Knickerbrick continued, "what came of the kings in their reign? They faded too. But it's very different with the witch. They say she ruled for 100 years. 100 years of winter. There's power, if you like. There's something practical." "But heaven and earth," said the king, "haven't we always been told that she was the worst enemy of all? Wasn't she a tyrant 10 times worse than Miraz?" "Perhaps," said Knickerbrick in a cold voice, "perhaps she was for you humans, if there were any of you in those days. Perhaps she was for some of the beasts. She stamped out the beavers, I dare say. At least there are none of them in Narnia now. But she got on all right with us dwarfs. I'm a dwarf, and I stand by my own people. We're not afraid of the witch." "But you've joined with us," said Trufflehunter. "Yes, and a lot of good it's done my people so far," snapped Knickerbrick. "Who's sent on all the dangerous raids? The dwarfs. Who goes short when rations fail? The dwarfs. Who—" "Lies, lies, all lies," said the Badger. "And so," said Knickerbrick, whose voice now rose to a scream, "if you can't help my people, I'll go to someone who can." "Is this open treason, dwarf?" asked the king. "Put that sword back in its sheath, Caspian," said Knickerbrick. "Murder at council, eh? Is that your game? Don't be fool enough to try it. Do you think I'm afraid of you? There's 3 on my side and 3 on yours." "Come on, then," snarled Trufflehunter, but he was immediately interrupted. "Stop, stop, stop," said Dr. Cornelius. "You go on too fast. The witch is dead. All the stories agree on that. What does Knickerbrick mean by calling on the witch?" That grey and terrible voice, which had spoken only once before, said, "Oh, is she?" And then the shrill, whining voice began, "Oh, bless his heart, his dear little majesty needn't mind about the White Lady. That's what we call her, being dead. The worshipful Master Doctor is only making game of a poor old woman like me when he says that. Sweet Master Doctor, learned Master Doctor, who ever heard of a witch that really died? You can always get them back." "Call her up," said the grey voice. "We are all ready. Draw the circle. Prepare the blue fire." Above the steadily increasing growl of the Badger and Cornelius's sharp "What?" rose the voice of King Caspian like thunder. "So that is your plan, Knickerbrick. Black sorcery and the calling up of an accursed ghost. And I see who your companions are, a hag and a werewolf." The next minute or so was very confused. There was an animal roaring, a clash of steel. The boys and Trumpkin rushed in. Peter had a glimpse of a horrible grey gaunt creature, half man and half wolf, in the very act of leaping upon a boy about his own age, and Edmund saw a badger and a dwarf rolling on the floor in a sort of catfight. Trumpkin found himself face to face with the hag. Her nose and chin stuck out like a pair of nutcrackers, her dirty grey hair was flying about her face, and she had just got Dr. Cornelius by the throat. At one slash of Trumpkin's sword her head rolled on the floor. Then the light was knocked over, and it was all swords, teeth, claws, fists, and boots for about 60 seconds. Then silence. "Are you all right, Ed?" I think so," panted Edmund. "I've got that brute Knickerbrick, but he's still alive." "Weights and water bottles," came an angry voice. "It's me you're sitting on. Get off. You're like a young elephant." "Sorry, DLF," said Edmund. "Is that better?" "Ow! No!" bellowed Trumpkin. "You're putting your boot in my mouth. Go away." "Is King Caspian anywhere?" asked Peter. "I'm here," said a rather faint voice. "Something bit me." They all heard the noise of someone striking a match. It was Edmund. The little flame showed his face, looking pale and dirty. He blundered about for a little, found the candle — they were no longer using the lamp, for they had run out of oil — set it on the table and lit it. When the flame rose clear, several people scrambled to their feet. 6 faces blinked at one another in the candlelight. "We don't seem to have any enemies left," said Peter. "There's the hag, dead. He turned his eyes quickly away from her. "And Nickabrick, dead too. And I suppose this thing is a werewolf. It's so long since I've seen one. Wolf's head and a man's body. That means he was just turning from man into wolf at the moment he was killed. And you, I suppose, are King Caspian." "Yes," said the other boy, "but I have no idea who you are." "It's the High King, King Peter," said Trumpkin. "Your Majesty is very welcome," said Caspian. "And so is your Majesty," said Peter. "I haven't come to take your place, you know, but to put you into it." "Your Majesty," said another voice at Peter's elbow. He turned and found himself face to face with the badger. Peter leaned forward, put his arms round the beast, and kissed the furry head. It wasn't a girlish thing for him to do, because he was the High King. "Best of badgers," he said, "you never doubted us all through." "No credit to me, your Majesty," said Truffle Hunter. "I'm a beast, and we don't change. I'm a badger, what's more, and we hold on." "I am sorry for Nickabrick," said Caspian, "though he hated me from the first moment he saw me. He had gone sour inside from long suffering and hating. If we had won quickly, he might have become a good dwarf in the days of peace. I don't know which of us killed him. I'm glad of that." "You're bleeding," said Peter. "Yes, I'm bitten," said Caspian. "It was that wolf thing." Cleaning and bandaging the wound took a long time, and when it was done, Trumpkin said, "Now, before everything else, we want some breakfast." "But not here," said Peter. "No," said Caspian with a shudder, "and we must send someone to take away the bodies." "Let the vermin be flung into a pit," said Peter, "but the dwarf we will give to his people to be buried in their own fashion." They breakfasted at last in another of the dark cellars of Aslan's Howe. It was not such a breakfast as they would have chosen, for Caspian and Cornelius were thinking of venison pasties, and Peter and Edmund of buttered eggs and hot coffee, but what everyone got was a little bit of cold bear meat out of the boys' pockets, a lump of hard cheese, an onion, and a mug of water. But from the way they fell to, anyone would have supposed it was delicious.
The story concludes with chapters 13 through 15 on the next recording.